Hey everybody, this is Dr. John Michael Salvato, and you're watching Inner Alchemy, the science of spiritual living. Each week we try to bring to you a fresh look, a new perspective at unpacking some of the ancient wisdom and interpreting it through a postmodern lens. And today is a special broadcast where we might normally have guests on the show. Today, I thought that we would share with you just one perspective. And I want to be really clear about that we really are mindful that this is a single perspective we're going to share with you about a possibility, a way forward to move beyond the witch wars, to move beyond some of the things that cause strife and division within our community, and to find a sort of a springboard from which we can approach esoteric arts and esoteric noetic sciences, maybe in a more culturally relevant and postmodern way. This is by popular request. This is a look at my spiritual path. And so as we get started, I just want to be really clear that this is my spiritual path. This is not anyone else's. It's not intended to be someone else's path. It is not intended to be the way forward or how we should be doing things. This is just my attempt to bring to our program, which airs every Saturday at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. That's 8 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time, and give the viewers an opportunity to just hear my perspective, to gain a little bit of insight into one of the ways we could move forward. And I think that the way forward for me has to be by understanding where we've come from, understanding our heritage, understanding that our heritage may share common threads, but it's a much broader tapestry than we often think. And so today we're also going to do something a little bit different. For the first time, I'm going to try to use, and the key word there is try. I'm going to try to use the screen share mode in this platform so that our Facebook Live actually becomes a live PowerPoint presentation. Now, I can't promise that I'm going to do it right. I can't promise that it's not going to have its hiccups and glitches, but we'll find out at the end of this program whether it was legible and viewable for you guys or not. And if you're watching us live, or even if you're watching the rebroadcast, we encourage you to comment, to give us your thoughts. I will say that I will be holding off on reading any of the comments until the end of the presentation itself. And then if there are any questions I can answer, I will attempt to do that at that time. So that's it. Let's get started and see if I can do this properly. So I guess the first thing I have to do is bring that slideshow into the broadcast, and then figure out how to do. I think it's this way. Yay! It worked. All right, great. So I think now from this point I can go into the slideshow. We'll see. So as we get started, and as I said, if this broadcast is all messed up, it will be a learning experience for us all. So today's topic on Inner Alchemy is witchcraft for the 21st century, and I think that it's a big undertaking. This is certainly not going to be one of those conversations that covers everything in 30 minutes or even in 45 minutes. But I think that it's worth understanding some basis, some foundational, common ground that exists for us that we might not be cognizant of existing. And at a time when it's so easy just to become disconnected, to draw lines in the sand, to say, oh, I saw your previous show and I disagree with everything about it, so don't talk to me anymore. That's the kind of spiritual and personal immaturity that begins these issues, this drama in the social media landscape and also in our personal lives. So on today's program, I'm going to try to cover a few things. We're going to talk about the ancient roots of the witchcraft tradition. We're going to talk about the historic development that we often forget about, the impact that the Malleus Maleficarum had on witches and on witchcraft in general, the beginnings of the Great Confusion and Restoration movements that followed, the Salem problem, the pop culture resurgence and postmodern practice, and what that might look like in our world. So let's just dive right into the ancient roots. And the practice of esoteric arts and metaphysical sciences goes back millennia across all cultures and nations. We can find some of the more ancient roots, whether we're talking about some of the animistic practices, some of the spiritual practices, folk magic practices. They cross all cultural divides. They cross all nations. And it can be found to have played a conspicuous role. If we really look at what witchcraft is, we see that in ancient Egypt and Babylonia or Akkadian, that there was a prevalent role that witchcraft or esoteric sciences played in those cultures. So this isn't something that that didn't really come to the fore until the 14th and 15th century. This isn't something that had its roots in one particular culture. So we can agree to set aside those arguments about whose tradition is the oldest, because it's impossible really to know, since all peoples from all times have apparently explored the esoteric arts. So let's first look at some of that historical context. Going back as far as 2000 before the Common Era, we find references to the practices of witchcraft in the Code of Hammurabi. And in that code, it says, I've got a quote there on the screen, it says, if a man has put a spell upon another man and is not justified, he upon whom the spell is laid shall go to the holy river. Into the holy river he shall plunge. If the river overcome him and he is drowned, the man who put the spell upon him shall take possession of his house. If the holy river declares him innocent and he remains unharmed, the man who laid this spell shall be put to death. He that plunged into the holy river shall take possession of the house of him who laid the spell upon him. So very clearly, the Code of Hammurabi addressed the practice of witchcraft and did not, I think it's significant to recognize that it does not decry witchcraft. It does not condemn witchcraft. It simply says that if a spell is put upon someone that is not justified, then these are the remedies. So going back at least as far as 2000 before the Common Era, we see that witchcraft was recognized in cultures that were civilized cultures. Now, when we move forward to the Abrahamic traditions, with the introduction particularly of the Christian cult, translations of the ancient Hebrew scriptures were often just so poorly done that the texts themselves became corrupted. We see in the Jewish Bible, in verses such as Deuteronomy 18, 11, and 12, and Exodus 22, verse 18, a reference to those who practice herbal medicine recklessly, without regard to Levitical law, and resulting in unintentional poisoning. That practice of herbal medicine is called kashaf, and that is unfortunately in the original Greek translations, it was properly translated, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But when it got translated later, that's where we began to see this term witch used and witchcraft used. So within the original Greek translations, the word was pharmakia, which is pharmacists essentially. So if we want to look at some of the earliest mentions in the Abrahamic traditions of witchcraft, we find out that what was really being referenced is what we would today call naturopathic medicine or herbology. Now, unfortunately, Scotland's King James I, who later ascended to the throne of England, as we all know, following the death of Elizabeth I, had the word mistranslated. Whether intentionally or unintentionally remains to be debated, because James had a real hard-on for witches. He was terrified of witchcraft. He was obsessed, almost to the point of a pathological obsession with the wretched text, the Malleus Maleficarum, which was written by a discredited clergyman, a Catholic priest named Heinrich Kramer in 1487. And because he was so obsessed with the Malleus Maleficarum, he went on to write, I forget the name of it, but he wrote a pamphlet or a little booklet that was published just before he became king of England, and it was focused on witchcraft, and it was focused largely on his obsession with the Malleus Maleficarum. It was focused on his fears, the fear mongering that he saw in Edinburgh, and as such, the word for herbalist or pharmacist became translated for the first time in 14 or 1500 thereabouts as witches. So since the beginning of recorded history, there have been men and women who've studied and understood the relationship that humanity has to the cosmos. Some of them have studied the stars. Some of them have studied the benefits of plants and herbs. Others have recognized the importance and power of words and thoughts or therapeutic touch. And many of these came from traditions in which the forces of nature were anthropomorphized. That means turned into human characters in their mythos. And as such, their practice of metaphysics were influenced by the local lore. So if you had somebody whose culture in say in India recognized the moon as Chandra, and so Chandra now was the personification of the moon. Or in the earliest texts, we see the male and female personifications of the planet Venus, which were in the Roman pantheon. We have Venus herself, the goddess. We also have Lucifer, who was just the morning star. He was the personification of that enlightenment, of that dawn, breaking dawn. And so cultures took these myths, they took these stories. We have to remember that primitive people didn't have all of the benefits of science, and so the personification or anthropomorphizing of these planets and forces of nature and concepts, archetypes, if you will, actually became sort of interwoven into their metaphysical practices. Now, that, I believe, gave rise to confusion. You see, by the mid-15th century in the Common Era, many people had begun to imagine the word witchcraft referred to a single practice. And that was largely because of people like Kramer and King James, because they imagined that this practice that they didn't understand was people operating under the influence of an imaginary devil. And so the Abrahamic traditions really became the fuel that resulted in burning at the stake. It was the fuel put on those stakes. Protestant superstition remains rife to this very day with that kind of fear mongering of witches and being under the possession of the devil. And I don't believe that in the modern era we're going to see that change a great deal, because it's big business. For the televangelists and the people who do their book tours and who fill the mega churches with audiences that are just sitting there waiting to find out how they can get rid of the influence of the devil in their lives, because these people are people who by spiritual practice are largely spiritually immature. They want a crutch, they want an excuse, and it's always easier to excuse your bad behavior, your bad decisions, or the bad decisions of others by blaming it on an imaginary being than it is to take 100% responsibility. And so this whole obsession with witchcraft being of a devil that most witches didn't even recognize as existing, was the beginning of that confusion. And we have to remember that while this is taking place in England and Scotland, and then making its way over to the New World, there were thousands of traditions that were completely unrecognized at that time. Witchcraft broadly means the practice of and belief in metaphysical laws and the abilities exercised by a solitary or group practitioners to gain a greater understanding, harmony, unity with the laws of nature. Now, witchcraft is a broad term. And as a result, that means that from culture to culture, the word itself or the word in that particular culture might mean something different. So it's really a challenge for us to define what witchcraft means in a universal sense, because it is a personal path. And so, for me, that's why it becomes problematic when you have religions that are created, because religions don't happen organically. You have religions that are created, and those religions use or co-opt the term witchcraft or Wicca or some of these terms. Not that they don't have a right to call themselves what they want, but in doing so, if they're using a broader term, then it becomes difficult to really understand sort of the global impact of using that word, because our words matter. So cross-cultural assumptions take place about the meaning and the significance of a term that should really be, I think, applied with caution. So that's the first place that we come from as we move forward, is recognizing that terms that words matter, and that the terms we use matter, that labels matter. They're unfortunate, but they matter. And so witchcraft often occupies a religious, divinatory, or medical role, and is present within various societies and groups whose framework include metaphysical and mystical worldviews. And so that is a broad, in my perspective, that's a broad explanation of what witchcraft is. It is a broad term that can include religious, divinatory, and medicinal practices. It can include societies and groups and individuals who hold a metaphysical or mystical worldview. It can be seen as just a philosophy of trying to bring your thoughts, your mind into control and harmony with universal law. And it could be all of those things or none of those things. And so we almost have to move beyond the arrogance and the ignorance, because we see that there's arguments that take place on social media, for example, and in real life, where witchcraft is debated about whether a person can call themselves a witch or not, whether they are entitled to that, or whether they identify with that word. In the modern ethos, there are those who staunchly rally against the term witch. They say that they want less stigmatized or hyper-masculinized words like mage and sorcerer, wizard and warlock. Now, quite often, those people don't understand the historic context of those words. They don't understand the anthropology. And bear with me for a minute if you're one of those people who says, no, I'm not a witch, I'm a shaman, or I'm not a witch, I'm a mage or a warlock or a wizard or whatever. But anthropologically, and whether we like it or not, anthropology matters. Witches differ from sorcerers. Witches differ from mages or wizards in that they don't use physical tools or actions to perform their craft. So I want to say that again, because I think it's an important distinction. A witch is somebody who conducts their work as something that extends from or derives from an intangible inner quality. A sorcerer, a mage, a wizard uses tools, tarot cards, for example, crystals, wands, and things like that, to harness external things. So hopefully you're beginning to see that in the modern era, The problem that we have is that our practices have become eclectic. And I say the problem because it's only a problem in terms of how we define ourselves. I think that the fact that eclecticism has actually become a really good thing from my perspective. But because that eclecticism has taken place, some of us might choose to identify as a mage, but their practice might not use any external tools. Another might say that they're a witch and rely heavily on the use of tarot cards or crystals or divination. I apologize for the noise. There's construction going on in the unit next to ours, and undoubtedly that always seems to happen when we are getting ready to shoot. So that's one of the problems is arrogance and ignorance comes in. No one has a right to tell anyone else what they can call their path. That doesn't mean that the person who says, okay, I am a shaman, I'm not a witch, doesn't owe an explanation to the person who's trying to genuinely understand what does that mean for you. But that's what's missing, is we often don't take the time to say, now explain to me what that means for you. Somebody on a board today said, I want to know if anybody does real magic. Well, what does that mean to you? I don't understand that question. And so unless we're willing to engage that, and all the person in that instance did was repeat the question, I want to know if anyone can do real magic. Well, that doesn't tell me what you're actually trying to find out, why you're trying to find it out. If you call yourself a mage, why is it that you don't identify with being a witch? It might be that you just don't like a term that's applied to female practitioners, or that is female centric. Maybe you want to use a term that gives the distinction that you are a male practitioner. So again, I am really sorry for the craziness of the noise that's going on here. Hopefully that won't be too distracting for you guys, and it is already distracting for me. So now we talk about witches and shaman, and what are some of the differences in those words? What are the connotations of those words? Well, the word witch, we have to really understand importantly that the word witch didn't really even exist until the Middle Ages, and it derives from the Old English word wicce or wicce, from which Wicca is derived. Prior to that, every culture had a word or words that described the people who worked with the esoteric. And in most cultures, those practitioners were often specialized. One may be focused on herbal medicine, another on soul mending, another on therapeutic touch or creating potions and healing. And often overlooked, the vast majority of these practitioners were primarily solo practitioners whose primary focus was on understanding their relationship to the cosmos and then sharing that with others to help others affect healing in their lives of one form or another. So it wasn't the culture that we see today that really began to develop in the in the 14th and 15th centuries, and that brings us to the problem with labels. By adopting words like witchcraft or paganism or Norse pagan or Wicca or trad witch, we unintentionally tend toward lumping a wide swath of practices, not all of which are compatible or similar in belief or praxis, into one misleading group. And so when we saw this in we have a talk show every week that's called The Brew, and many of you have probably seen that. My co-host on that show is my brother Raphael Ray from Radiant Reality. And the talk show itself at one point had a co-host on it who was a member of the Norse pagan tradition, and that is a very fine tradition. It's an honorable path and practice, and one that I really felt we could learn a lot from, because I wanted to sort of highlight that diversity that exists. I wanted to hear perspectives from different sources. Well, unfortunately, for reasons many of you have already seen and we're not going to rehash, it wasn't a good fit, and our co-host decided to move on to other things. And while we truly wish him well, unfortunately, the reality is that person has continued to respond in negative ways to me because they don't like being confronted on issues like their fundamentalism or the superiority complex with which that individual seem to denigrate those who charge for tarot readings, for example, or for classes that they teach, because that's not consistent with his particular tradition, and we have to honor that in his tradition it wouldn't be right for him in his interpretation of that tradition to charge for classes or to charge for any of his services as a shaman. While for somebody else that might be, wholly appropriate and acceptable. So even when cultures have many different meanings, many different implications. For example, in my own tradition of Etruscan witchcraft, which can be traced back in my family to about the 4th or 5th century before the Common Era, we were called strege, and our path was known by many names, including stregeria. It was also known by no name. It was the unnamed path. But in today's culture, that same word not only describes the path and tradition that my ancestors practiced, but it also describes neo-paganism, a restoration movement, a Catholic syncretic tradition. It draws on some of the errant research, I believe, of Charles Leland, who I think was duped into believing some texts and stories that were completely fabricated were actually historically intact. And as a result, there are some unsavory practitioners out there trying to peddle their books and workshops who are not really sharing. They're calling what they're doing stregeria, but they're not really teaching stregeria. They're drawing on Leland's work and things like that. So these words can be deceptive. That's the trouble with labels. And I think if we're going to move forward and become a community in the LGBTQ pagan community, particularly the community with which I work and associate myself, I think we have to drop the labels. We have to be willing to stop letting labels define us and just use them as tools to start a conversation. And then, for me, this is the part of my vision for the future that might be a little bit controversial, because in my perspective, as somebody who has served as a Buddhist abbot for a Buddhist monastery and as a Catholic priest and archbishop, I can tell you that within the world experience I've encountered, religion spoils everything. And what I mean by that is that when we take the organic and the inorganic evolution of religious syncretism, the tendency that the Roman Church had, for example, to steal every single tradition within paganism and try and turn it into a Catholic celebration, or take a god like or goddess like Bridget and turn her into Saint Bridget, or the mythos of Saint Christopher or Saint Valentine and things like that, then what happens? It complicates the understanding of the reality of these traditions. It complicates our understanding of the historicity. And the pagan tradition is nothing if not the art and science of storytelling and bringing that back in. In the Jewish tradition, we call that midrash. The midrashic texts are stories that are told in Hebrew scripture that are meant to serve as a teaching device, not as an historic book. And so our stories get convoluted, our stories may become misguided, and these layers of syncretism sometimes can do more harm than good. And so that gave us the witch wars. It gave us the mass persecutions, witch trials, burning at the stake, the scourge of pilgrims and Protestant fundamentalists and their obsession with their imaginary devils and demons. It gave us televangelists and fundamentalist pseudo-Norsemen in an era where we already are plagued with the New Age centers who have people who claim to be healers, whose ego is so wrapped up in the need for recognition that they will tell you that they're going to heal you. When you have, by contrast, people like my friends in the Center for Inner Wisdom, now known as the Zero Point Center in Fort Lauderdale, where the people who are engaged in their healing program, their healing outreach, will tell you that they are simply conduits to help that person sitting in that chair, coming for healing, to unlock the healing ability that's always been theirs. So they're there to be a conduit to support the healing process. They're not standing out there and saying, I'm a magical healer and give me all your money. They're actually doing their, providing their services for free to the people who are the most desperate, the people who are most in need. And of course, there are people who come there and who make a donation because they know that the work that's being done there is powerful. So when we attempt to bind something to a religion, then the very first thing we're doing is we're binding it to doctrine, we're binding it to dogma, we're binding it to some sort of hierarchy, because with the exception, I think, of maybe the Congregationalist religious sects, there's always somebody who's in charge, and so ego becomes involved. And for me, now for some, maybe that's fine. For practitioners of Wicca, some of whom are some of my closest friends, when they're in a great group, and a group that's respectful, and a group that honors the tradition, it can be a beautiful thing. And I've actually had Wiccan priests and priestesses come to some of the ordinations when I was a bishop. We had when I ordained somebody, I would invite some of my Wiccan priestess and priest friends to come and lay hands on the person who is being ordained, recognizing that universal power that we have, that we're unlocking in that person who's the ordinand, the person who's about to be ordained, is a universal power. It is the power that already resides within that person, and all we're doing is celebrating the unlocking. So I'm not saying that if you're involved in a religion, you're a bad person. I'm just saying that religion spoils everything in my experience, because the fights that happen usually because people drew lines in the sand. If our former co-host was not a fundamentalist, if his spiritual path were simply to follow the path of Asatru or any of the ancient Norse traditions, and it was honest and authentically Norse, then it would have recognized that in that tradition, every home is like a church in and of itself. And so has to be honor for the church next door, and the church across the street, and the church down the road. Instead, what happened was that person's brokenness, that person's woundedness, that person's delusions actually became their religion. And Norse paganism was sort of the wrapping that was put on the outside to make it seem more palatable. And that's an unfortunate thing. And it's not certainly not to criticize those who found themselves in that position, because that has happened. And the attempt to syncretize, or the syncretism itself, can be a good thing and a bad thing. In my own practice, in the interest of full transparency, my journey has been one of syncretism. I've had a Tibetan Buddhist Lama who, not realizing that I was part of one of the groups that she led, was bad-mouthing me, ridiculing me, as tulkus like her supposedly never do. She was ridiculing me and saying that for me, this must all be about dress up, because you can't be a Buddhist monk and a Catholic bishop at the same time. You can't be a Buddhist monk and a witch at the same time. You can't be a witch and a priest at the same time. And, really this was more about just creating a distraction from that particular Lama's own questionable claims of lineage and such. So in my own tradition, I've practiced Catholic Stegeria, the sort of the neo pagan version of Stegeria. I've attempted to incorporate and draw deeply from esoteric Buddhism, Wedgwood esotericism, which is a metaphysical Catholicism, Luciferianism, which remains my path today, Santeria, male-centric coven work. There were periods, wonderful periods of time, in which I connected with male covens, and I'm sure there will be again. The New Thought movement was a very powerful, informative part of my journey to spiritual maturity, and that's a journey, by the way, that's still going on. You know, I haven't gotten there. There's no, you know, there isn't a physical Bodhi tree to sit under and suddenly wake up one day and proclaim that I have all the answers. You know, neo-paganism was a very big part, whether that be drawing from Wicca, drawing from trad witches, drawing from the voodoo tradition, which is something very close to my own personal practice. You know, having had the opportunity to sit as an abbot in a monastery outside of New Orleans, I had access to some of the most amazing practitioners, you know, in the lineage of Marie Laveau, who really helped me to understand some of the incredible works that they do. Naturopathic medicine is a form of, as we talked about earlier, is a form of the same history and cosmic practice that witchcraft comes from, and therapeutic touch like massage and Reiki and things like that. So I've been there, I've tried that, and for me, I guess we get to the point of what is my vision. You know, in the end, I recognized that there was only one reason, one purpose for what I'm doing, one purpose for the path, and that was mastery of my mind, unlocking the mysteries of the cosmos. So it was an inside job. And so for me personally, that meant that I needed to sort of distance myself for a while, for a time, from all of the ritual work. That's why I walked away from the high priest role in our Grand Coven, because while I, in some people's minds, was being groomed for that from the time I was 6 until I assumed that position. In my mind, in order to be of the best service to the world around me, I needed to step back from some of the ritual, and I needed to really do the hard, gritty, dirty, unglamorous work on myself, on my mind, on getting rid of my baggage, my bullshit. And that was, after all, the universal thread in every tradition that I studied was mind control, mind mastery. It was the key to my own personal mastery, you know, overcoming sexual abuse at the hands of clergy as a teen and a young adult, overcoming being raped and beaten at gunpoint by 4 assailants when I was 20, overcoming the reality of being infected with the virus that causes AIDS, you know, as a result of that rape. My ability to overcome those things, the personal mastery behind that, all came with learning to understand and master my own mind, taking 100% responsibility for every experience that I have, recognizing that the things that are going on around me at any time, any conflict, any good thing, any neutral experience, that my perceptions of those experiences are based on the chaotic data that I haven't let go of yet. And they are a reflection of the things within myself, within my mind, that I can release, that I can heal, that I can let go of. And so I didn't feel personally that I needed validation or permission from any so-called authority. And for that reason, I let all of the religious traditions go. I let all of the connections to hierarchical organizations go, because this is a personal path for me. And I'm not saying that we can't be part of, as I said, there will probably be times when I'll be happy to be part of a male-centric, particularly gay male-centric coven. And that's because as social beings, being part of a group can be a good thing. But I have to come from that place of being aware that this is a personal journey, that this is not a communal journey. The group may indeed go on a journey, but that journey is secondary to the personal journey and my personal practice. That at the end of the day, every one of us is really a solo practitioner, or we're not a practitioner at all. So in the end, I found myself ostracized at first from those who couldn't create space for individuality or singularity in their minds. And I think that might happen to many of us. I think, in fact, that it is happening to many of us. But I would like to see and dream of a day when we can become a tradition that recognizes that our roles are revolving roles and what I call the path of archetypes. See, in my spiritual tradition, I'm the magician who makes dreams come true. I'm the sage who always seeks the truth. I'm the innocent, just who wants nothing more than to experience joy and love and happiness. I'm the outlaw who seeks to create and sustain revolution. I'm the jester who lives in the moment and is disrespectful and inappropriate at times. And anybody who's seen my Facebook wall certainly knows that to be true. I'm the lover that makes you theirs. I'm the explorer that breaks free, the creator that manifests everything there is, and the destroyer that no longer, that destroys that which no longer serves. See, if we could embrace this path of archetypes, then I think it's easier to understand and respect other people's traditions, because the characters in their traditions, the characters in their sacred stories, including the Abrahamic traditions, including the Eastern traditions, including the African traditions, they fall into one of these divine archetypes that I think are such great opportunities for us to deeper understand ourselves and the complex nature of who we are as people. And so for me, when someone says, well, what is your tradition? My tradition is chaos magic, or Luciferian magic. It's been called by many different names. Chaos magic describes the union of traditional occult practices and applied postmodernism, particularly a postmodern skepticism that is concerned with the existence or knowability of objective truth. This practice led me to subsequently treat belief as a tool. So I'm not I don't have a big emphasis on what do you believe. Belief is just one of the tools in my tool belt. It helps me develop my own idiosyncratic system of witchcraft that draws on other magical traditions, draws on Luciferian philosophy, Stregoria, New Thought, and various strands of Jungian psychology. So for me, the path of the chaos magician includes another form of magic that often gets overlooked because we just think it's science, and that is psychology, because that's the understanding of the mind. And there's no greater magic there than exploring the shadow self. So chaos magic for me is always a matter of inner alchemy. And the reason that this show exists, the reason that I've done the Inner Alchemy show for the last 5 years, has been all about making chaos magic, which sometimes gets a bad rap, sometimes gets sullied by some of the pop culture fanboy type practitioners who have tried to turn it into Satanism and the Church of Satan and all these other fringe movements that are based basically on fanboy mythology and pretending that archetypes are real and really wanting to just be countercultural. So chaos magic is inner alchemy. With my personal tradition, in what my path includes, there's 4 main paths that are always available to me as a witch, and I identify as a witch. I am a shamanic alchemist. I communicate my intentions to the spiritual world and its inhabitants, who then work magic on my behalf or aid me in the working of magic to achieve a desired result. I'm an energetic alchemist. And that means that I direct my own energy towards specific aims, specific purposes, and bend the universe to my will. It means that I reject ideas like the like the rule of three, or any of these other pop culture ideas that have worked their way into witchcraft, the golden rule and all of that other stuff that comes from the Christian tradition. It's just syncretism. I'm a mental alchemist, and that means I use symbols to condition my unconscious mind to work towards stated goals. And I'm a neo-alchemist, which means I transmit information on an underlying matrix or a field of energy in order to produce specific effects. And that includes the use of technology, of electronic medium, of technologies like sound magic and color magic and sigils and things like that. But what I think I want most to be able to bring to the world is recognition that this is your journey, this is your choice. The purpose of your spiritual path is personal mastery and nothing else, and the reclamation of your power. And no one has a right to tell you how to approach it. No one has a right to tell you what you can or can't do to achieve those goals, and to work toward that experience. And you can change that approach every single moment. If it's not working for you, let it go. There's no shame to be had because you've tried a different spiritual path and it didn't work out for you. You connected with a group of people and they didn't work out for you. Finding a mentor should not be something of surrendering your will to someone. It's a true mentor should be someone who helps you explore your options, who helps you to dig deeper and find your answers, not someone who gives you the answers. Someone who says, this is what I'm thinking, and where I think you might want to dig a little deeper until you uncover your answers. Call yourself whatever you want to call yourself, whether you want to be a witch, a shaman, a Norse pagan, a mage, a sorcerer. I hesitate to say if you want to call yourself a warlock, unless you are an oath breaker, as I am, then you're really not a warlock. You're doing yourself a disservice. Or call yourself nothing at all. That's another option that's available to you. Simply live in your magical experience of life. Unlock your personal power. Stay in the moment, and just resolve to remain mindful that labels are human constructs and nothing more, and they don't always mean the same thing to everyone. So if we can allow that space to honor someone else's tradition, someone else's name, what someone else thinks that word means for them, if we can take the time to care enough about that, then I think we've made a powerful first step. I think we've really begun to do the work of connecting as people, connecting as fellow sojourners on the path. And there's no greater way to do that than by taking that time to cultivate relationships. Because if we don't cultivate a relationship with somebody, there's little chance that we're going to understand what their perspective is and where their perspective is coming from. It's all about learning to honor the sacred story of the other. So let's jump in and take a look. I actually see we only have one comment from my brother Richard. So let me put it up on the screen, because I always love to hear from you, Richard. And Richard writes, "What matters is giving people time to explain what they do, regardless of the titles, rather than rely on one noun to define it all." Absolutely. And just for those who are watching, on one of on our next talk show, on the next installment of The Brew, Richard is going to be our guest this coming Wednesday, and we're going to talk about the importance of the sacred stories in our journey, and how our stories are that connecting point, that sort of the basis of that alchemy. So Richard, thanks for being here. We'll see whether a Saturday afternoon was a good time to have this show. I'm thinking that it might not be, based on the number of views we've seen so far. I am going to put back up on the screen and put it as solo. The contact information, if you'd like to connect with us, we welcome you to connect with us on Facebook. we welcome you to connect with us on the web and to connect with us here for our broadcast, which might end up being on Sunday afternoons and not Saturday afternoons. We shall see. And thanks to everybody for your kindness in asking me to let's close that, in asking me how I'm doing, how I'm feeling. Richard is a great one to check in every morning, and so many of you have been. I am feeling better. Still a little weak, still struggling a little bit. You probably heard in my voice, struggling a little bit to really get back on top, but I will get there, and the end result of this process will be just incredible healing and a greater understanding of where I go from here. So, guys, thanks for your love. I appreciate each and every one of you. Be sure to share this if you would with folks on your timeline that you think might be interested. We'd love to hear from them as well. And until next time, as I say at the end of every one of these broadcasts, I encourage you to stay in the moment. Be grateful for what you've got, because if you can't be grateful for what you've got, there's no reason to believe that you're going to be happier with anything more. And always remember, the best is yet to come. We'll talk to you soon. Namaste, everybody.